Hi, I'm Ken Howard, and welcome to the Gay Therapy LA podcast. Today, I'd like to talk about why white gay men should be supporting Black Lives Matter. Occasionally I like to talk about current events, and, most of these episodes are designed to be what I call evergreen content on helping LGBT people in general, and gay men in particular, about issues that I help them with daily, in my practice over a long time, 28 years, as a gay men's specialist therapist and life, career, and relationship coach. But, once in a while, there's an item in the news that moves me enough to comment because, I am a licensed psychotherapist and social worker and professor and author and lots of those titles. But once in a while, I think of myself as the social worker, as the advocate, or even as the activist. And that's what I'm really talking about today, speaking as an activist to promote the idea of social justice. And the recent murder of a young black male jogger in Brunswick, Georgia is one such case. You've heard about him, probably. His name was Ahmaud Arbery, and he was 25 years old. And this incident was captured on video by a driver behind the scene of what happened. And in California, both Vice President Joe Biden and Senator Kamala Harris have made statements of outrage about the vigilante incident by two white men who shot and killed the young black man who had merely looked inside the window of a vacant home under construction and then continued jogging. But he apparently was claimed to look like, according to the perpetrators, someone who was wanted for a local burglary. Now they're even saying they're not even sure those burglaries existed. But the suspects chased Arbery down in their pickup truck and screamed that they wanted to talk to him, and they pulled guns on him, a shotgun and another gun. The governor of Georgia, Brian Kemp, made a statement calling for answers to the state of Georgia and its citizens. And since then, he has supported the arrest of the suspects. They've been arrested now. But in a prior photo, he was photographed with one of the suspects who was wearing a Trump t-shirt. And apparently, the alleged murderers, we say alleged for legal reasons, but it's pretty clear who they were. They were big Trump supporters, and apparently they were racist, and they took it upon themselves to shoot down an unarmed black man in cold blood. That's a pretty outrageous act of injustice. One of the perpetrators, allegedly, is an ex-cop who had his photo taken with Governor Kemp, who was also a Trump supporter. So they are arrested now, the two of them, the father and son, alleged perpetrators, and they will face a case when the courts start to move along very slowly with the COVID-19 crisis. But this case, along with so many others, the Trayvon Martin case, this was related to NFL player Colin Kaepernick to famously take a knee during the playing of the national anthem at football games to publicly call attention and protest the repeated and widespread police brutality nationwide and the murder of numerous unarmed black men and the rising popularity of the hashtag Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter is brilliant in its efficiency in summing up the notion that we, all fair-minded people, must challenge this idea that the lives of black Americans are somehow disposable or not equal to the lives of white Americans, as evidenced by these many groundless defenses that mask, frankly, murders. It harkens back to, if you know your history, to the 3/5 Compromise, where black Americans would only be counted as 3/5 of the white American for political representation. It's tragic that anyone needs reminding of what the value of a human life is, but apparently this is what it's come to, a situation made worse that we're so far away from the days of slavery and Jim Crow laws and even a half century past the 1964 Civil Rights Act, and yet systemic, institutional, and cultural racism persists, generation after generation after slavery, long after it should have died out, and it shouldn't have been there in the first place. So I've taken to using the hashtag whites for Black Lives Matter. even when I don't even know if that's a thing or not, because of the simple idea that I don't believe that the notion that black Americans should be treated with fairness, dignity, and equality like everyone else is something that's limited to African American people. In a similar vein, I don't think fighting for LGBT rights and equality is limited to LGBT people. We have a lot of visibility and a lot of gratitude for our straight allies who also believe that LGBT people should be treated under the law with fairness and dignity and equality in society and in the law. Or when you think about it, Gentiles for Jews, or feminist men for women, or native citizens for immigrants, or uterus-free men, because some men who are trans actually have uteruses, but uterus-free men for pro-choice, middle and upper middle classes, or the upper classes for the working classes, traditionally abled for the differently abled, younger people for elderly people. Okay, you get the idea that when we're talking about rights and social justice, we're not talking about advocating for those rights just within the group that we're talking about. We can have a coalition, and we can have friends of that group working to protect the rights of that group. So a saying from the civil rights era says, as long as one of us is oppressed, none of us is free. We all have a collective stake in the advancement of society to see that social justice is promoted, and that the enemies to broad social justice are challenged pretty virulently. The tyranny of the majority, or the dominant paradigm that promotes the idea that only straight, white, cisgender, Protestant, married, parenting, middle class or higher, and traditionally abled men have legitimacy or are entitled to power in society must be challenged. But part of the tyranny of the ruling class, as is usually manifested in the Republican Party, involves maintaining that these straight wasps control our politics, our institutions, and our culture, and divide everyone else into infighting and chaos so that they never really threaten the dominant paradigm. And that needs to change. I'm a child of the 60s and 70s. I get frustrated that we were doing so well there for a while, and then Reagan, the Bushes, and certainly Trump have brought out the extremes of racism and intolerance that we haven't seen since the 50s, and it's come roaring back, at least in terms of visibility of these deplorables, out from under their collective rock after the feel-good 60s and 70s. And when you consider the numeric membership of all the combined so-called minority groups in America, suddenly they aren't so minority anymore. Sure, I totally own that I have white, cisgender, male, traditionally abled class and education privilege. It's so easy, I realize, for others to say, what the hell would he know about oppression? And they would be correct, except to say that I do not have heterosexual privilege, nor HIV-negative privilege, nor youth privilege, nor appearance privilege, nor class privilege above the middle class. And so this is not to say poor me, because I realize it's ludicrous in the face of considerable privilege, which I realize I have, but my point is that in my typical Libra social worker child of the 60s passion for social justice, maybe you can tell, I have the empathy to think outside of my own demographic box categories, to take into consideration how others fare in our society, particularly in America as a place we all share and should have equal access to. E pluribus unum, Latin for out of many we are one. As a proud social work clinician and academic, I promote the idea that social workers are the agents of social change. Or, in other words, when I see an injustice, I'll tell your ass off. That's the other words. So why is supporting social justice for other groups important for the LGBT community in general and gay men in particular? And it's because of the idea that we're all interconnected. We can achieve more together than we can individually as separate or even rival minority groups. The Democratic Party in general has banked on this. Democrats tend to win in political races when coalitions of minority groups, along with some WASPs and some others, join together in the fight against the inherent racism, sexism, classism, homophobia, xenophobia, ableism, anti-intellectualism, anti-science, anti-Semitism, etc., that are so rampant in the Republican Party. But in the Republican recent past, like the 1970s, and certainly in the pseudo-fascist theocratic oligarchy that it's become today, especially under Trump, but also under Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, soon to be ousted, hopefully, by the very gender non-conforming but heterosexual Amy McGrath in Kentucky, it has become distilled into this haven for hate in that whole party. So the LGBT community would do well to deliberately look for ways to form mutually beneficial political and social coalitions with other minority groups, supporting the idea that strength in numbers is important when we're fighting a common enemy of oppression and tyranny of the majority. A diverse coalition of minority groups working individually and collectively for justice, campaigning and voting together, tends to elect Democrats who then go on to do good things in the form of black-letter law and policy. President Barack Obama provided leadership under whose terms we saw the end of Don't Ask, Don't Tell and national marriage equality, in part due to his appointments of progressives to the Supreme Court. Obama was also behind a very long list of other LGBT and gender protections by executive order or judicial appointments, many of which were targeted for immediate reversal by Trump and his cabinet, such as protections for trans students and students with disabilities being stripped of one of the most vile embodiments of pure hate on the American political stage today, and that's Secretary of Education Betsy DeVos. She's an unqualified, vicious opponent and saboteur of quality public education, but she's a big Republican donor with ties to conservative extremist groups and policies, and she was appointed by Trump to be a member of his cabinet to oversee and actually sabotage public education in this country. The passage of the Affordable Care Act has supported everyone, but especially helped in access to care for minority groups. A Democratic Secretary of Education helps fund diversity in public school curricula that promotes tolerance, including tolerance for LGBT people. A conservative Secretary of Education does not fund those things and works to quash those things so that our children are growing up in an atmosphere of intolerance. A Democratic Secretary of Labor fights for workers' rights, especially for working minorities. A Democratic Attorney General helps support laws that prosecute discrimination and hate crimes, whereas a Republican one tends to either eliminate those or certainly to de-emphasize them. A Democratic Secretary of Health and Human Services helps improve health outcomes for minority groups. And a Democratic Health and Human Services Secretary helps to support the inclusion of trans people and other LGBT people in American public health policy. A Democratic Secretary of State will help support social justice abroad, such as fighting the Kill the Gays bills, like in Uganda and in other countries, and tying federal aid to human rights. This happened under Obama. This does not happen under Trump. And those Kill the Gays bills gain new ground because American evangelicals and their Republican supporters help to foment the Kill the Gays bills in other countries. They've had limited success, thankfully, but it's not for lack of trying. And a Democratic president, of course, can appoint federal district judges and Supreme Court judges who render minority-friendly decisions for many groups. I strongly believe that if gay men, as well as others in the LGBT community and other minority communities that include women, immigrants, Latinx communities, Armenian, Asian, Jewish, etc., and I realize these groups overlap with the LGBT community, but if we band together as one, we can achieve more strides in social justice than any one of our factions can do by going it alone. And this is true even within the LGBT community. Many older gay men today, like me, tend to understandably remind today's younger generation of how gay men, we like to remind the younger generation of gay men how instrumental lesbian nurses were during the height of the AIDS epidemic in the 80s and 90s. Heroically, they stood up and did the work of caretaking for very sick gay men, when many others, disgustingly, refused to be in the same hospital room with them, let alone touch them or provide care. Gay men and lesbians would do well to support our trans brothers and sisters and non-binary colleagues in the greater LGBT rights movement. And gay bars and clubs really need to do a better job of confronting the obvious racism seen there in gay urban centers all over the world, especially in Los Angeles, where we see people of color, Black and Latinx, are not represented in the proportions that they are in the general population of the city. Even resorts catering to gay men are very conspicuously white, which is both a race issue and a class issue. During the 90s, my best friend was a straight cisgender Jewish woman, and I would accompany her to pro-choice rallies for NOW, the National Organization for Women, and she would accompany me to gay rights rallies, often involving the Human Rights Campaign. And when her straight female friends would ask, "But you're not a lesbian, why do you bother?" she would say, in her characteristic booming Bette Midler when she's pissed off kind of voice, "Because I'll tell you something, as soon as they finish coming after them, they're coming after me." And this was a reference, perhaps unknowingly, to the famous German pastor Martin Niemöller quote from 1946. This is what he said. "First they came for the communists, and I did not speak out, because I was not a communist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out, because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out, because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me." Now, while Niemöller has been controversial for some anti-Semitic remarks that he did make in other contexts, research shows, he later recanted these, and his famous poem or quote is featured in Holocaust memorials all over the world. His point is that groups who are outside the persecuted group should not just sit idly by and calmly watch when injustice is being meted out by others. Intolerance and oppression are a slippery slope, and you never know what's next, who's next, for being singled out for oppression, until everyone is, except a certain very privileged elite. You know, it's also important to remember that in contrast to the me generation of the 70s, or the selfish millennials, as they are sometimes called, you know, the white, straight, racist, heterosexual, America first, make America great again, Republicans and others, it is a sign of emotional intelligence, adult maturity, and the absence of personality disorders, such as the narcissistic or the antisocial personality disorder, to show empathy for others. It is not, as some might defend, cultural appropriation to defend the rights of groups that one is not a part of. I say the words joie de vivre, and I am not French. I say Schadenfreude, and I am not German. I say Mazel Tov and a host of other Yiddish phrases, and am not Jewish. I speak Spanish, and I am not Latinx. I crave Asian food daily, but am not Asian. I am an urban gay liberal who consciously develops an appreciation for a diversity of historical and cultural influences that spans the globe and all of history. E pluribus unum. Now, the more snarky queens, could easily lob the criticism, if we say that it's a criticism, that I defend Black Lives Matter because I probably have a penchant for black men or BBC, or have a big old case of, girl, she's got jungle fever. Okay, so maybe I'm a little guilty of that one in the past. Mr. Olympia winners have been African American men, and I stand in awe of their achievement in bodybuilding, among countless other African American heroes in many fields. And I wouldn't exactly throw, Billy Brown or Rome Flynn or Dylan Burnside or Michael B. Jordan. Look these guys up on YouTube and click on images and you'll see what I mean. Billy Brown, Rome Flynn, Dylan Burnside, or Michael B. Jordan. I wouldn't throw those guys out of bed. But, this goes beyond that kind of catty criticism. When I work with gay black men in my practice, I hear how objectification of them for any reason, whether it's positive, as a sexualized object, or negative, they're just different sides of the same coin. objects as opposed to three-dimensional grown men with equal ambitions and rights as everyone else. With the exception of February as Black History Month, the recognition of the contribution of African Americans historically to the historical fabric of America really needs some work. There's an underrepresentation or an under-awareness of how much historically Black Americans have contributed to this country. It's not just all about the white founding fathers. So, I'm not perfect, I don't claim to be, but my point is that if we strive to look outside of our own insular groups, if we lend some passion and energy toward working for political and social justice for groups outside of the ones we belong to, we create a more unified and just world. Now, I am the first one to criticize Black Americans who are homophobic due to the influence of anti-LGBT religious teachings. And I take issue with many Black churches who decry bigotry against them but have no problem dishing it out to others, such as the LGBT community. And I find it rich that double minorities like African American women, one of whom I encountered when I was volunteering on Election Day in 2008 for No on Prop 8 in California, that would viciously attack and use the power of their vote against the notion that LGBT people should actually have equal rights under the law of the land, when the widow of the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. himself, Coretta Scott King, was famously pro-LGBT. But even for that hostile voter woman on Election Day, I still don't want to see her son killed for walking down the street eating Skittles, like Trayvon Martin, or as Senator Kamala Harris said about Ahmaud Arbery, exercising while Black. The organization AwareLA.org, which is White People for Black Lives, states that we believe change happens when we build with millions of other people to change culture, policies, and practices. We need a mass movement to make change. I agree with this. I lend my voice and any influence I can in social media, comments, conversations, Facebook posts, whatever, to the notion that a mass movement of collaborative minorities or outgroups will begin to address some very deeply entrenched historical problems in social justice in our country. We as gay men can start and say that while equal rights, dignity, and justice for LGBT people might be my favorite cause, I will not be unsympathetic to others. Because as soon as they finish coming after them, they're coming after us. The spirit of Stonewall was a diverse coalition banding together at long last to create an enduring justice. And we can continue that spirit today. Rise up. I'll see you next time.